We're working on that final war. It's not easy, but I don't know. I think we're going to get there.
That framework is on the table, and we are ready to move forward together with the United States of America. And I'm ready to meet with President Trump. And there are sensitive points to discuss. We have them still.
We are naturally ready, as the president said, to discuss specific wording, because a number of issues there certainly require clarification.
Devil's always in the details, but it does appear, or at least the signals are coming from the White House and other places, that they're closer to a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine to end the war. President putting out a Truth Social about the Ukraine war. The original 28-point peace plan, which was drafted by the United States, has been fine-tuned with additional input from both sides, and there are only a few remaining points of disagreement. I have directed my special envoy, Steve Witkoff, to meet with President Putin in Moscow, and at the same time, Secretary of the Army Dan Driscoll will be meeting with the Ukrainians. I look forward to hopefully meeting with President Zelensky and President Putin soon, but only when the deal to end this war is final or in its final stages. So we've seen a number of iterations, but this seems like it's coming at least to a head. Let's bring in our panel. Matthew Continetti, scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, Wall Street Journal opinion columnist, Susan Page, Washington bureau chief at USA Today, and Leslie Marshall, Fox News contributor. Matthew, there are positive signals. Ukraine, Russia, the U.S. Obviously, the devil's in the details.
The devil's always in the details. This living, breathing document, as Secretary Rubio called it, has grown. It's grown in a way that it seems to satisfy the Ukrainians, even though there's some outstanding issues that President Zelensky and President Trump will decide together. But the question that remains, Brett, as always, is what will Russia do? What will Vladimir Putin do? And the fact of the matter is, throughout this lengthy process where President Trump has been trying nobly to end the war in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have, with pressure, come to the American position time and again, and Russia always says niet.
Yeah. Susan, interesting, the Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, the Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, going separate ways. They're using a number of different officials, as well as Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and they're delivering these messages separately to try to get them to come together before the president gets involved. You know, this is after Alaska, after these previous calls that we've had.
You know, there's clearly a plan that Russia will agree to, and there's a plan that Ukraine will agree to, but they are not the same plan. And that is sort of underscored by the fact that they're not really talking to each other, that you have these separate envoys going their separate ways. You know, the language is still optimistic, but it is, President Trump has really backed off his initial demand of a Thanksgiving deadline to reach this. It sounds to me like that he's prepared a little more for what we've seen before, which is sometimes hopeful signs. Certainly President Trump pushing for a resolution to this war. That would be, everyone would be glad to see this war end. But until things like territorial concessions are worked out, it's hard to see how this gets done.
Right. And there may be, and we don't really know exactly where that stands. There was some talk that Russia demand of taking territory that they hadn't even taken yet in the war may be off the table. But we don't have the specifics, Leslie. The Ukrainian president tweeted out that last night Russia launched another attack at a time when Ukraine, together with America, Europe, and many others around the world, are working virtually around the clock to stop the bloodshed. That attack was on Zaporizhzhia, the regional administration. And there's, these attacks have been pretty spectacular as far as their reach inside Ukraine, what they're doing. There's buildings on fire, and a lot of people are being killed. There is a tiredness on both sides if you talk to Ukrainians and Russians, but Putin has been the one that has struck deep into Ukraine time and time again.
Actually, and that goes to Matthew's point and also to Susan's point. Here are the big three for President Zelensky, and yeah, they're battered, they're beaten, they're worn, they're tired on both sides. Certainly the civilians and of course the military as well. But when you look at what he's asking for, he's saying, look, I want the European allies to sign on to this and be a part of this, and he's asking for a reassurance force because of exactly what you're talking about, Brett, if Moscow does this again. And to Matthew's point, you know, when somebody shows you who they are, you got to believe them. And what we have seen is Putin is not a man and a leader with this country and with these types of peacekeeping efforts to be trusted. And then, of course, to Susan's point, when it comes down to the territory, I mean, you know, Putin is not going to give up on that. He hasn't in the past, and neither is President Zelensky. So I'm not trying to rain on the parade here. I certainly want peace. I think everyone in the world does. But these territorial concessions have been the sticking point in the past, and I fear they might be now.
Yeah. But Matthew, last thing on this. I mean, there are levers to pull that push Putin's buttons, that put pressure on Putin. They haven't all been pulled yet.
No, they haven't. I think one key element is China. And that's why I think that President Trump's conversation with Xi Jinping yesterday was so interesting, Brett. I know that Xi Jinping initiated the call to talk about a dispute between China and Japan, but according to reporting, President Trump talked about Ukraine because, of course, China is fueling Russia's war in Ukraine. Secondary sanctions on China, their purchases of Russian oil, the same way that we're tariffing India for their purchases of Russian oil, could put the pressure on Putin to sign a deal that leaves Ukraine in a defensible position for the future.
Yeah, speaking of the U.S.-China talks, here's the Treasury Secretary.
We're always going to be rivals. That's natural. But are there things we can do together? Yes. We have the relationship in a good place.
Yes, we need a lot of things, but we also are a country that could replace every single thing we get from China. And the president's shown a policy, America First policy, that's going to replace some of them. And if China waits too long, we'll replace them all.
Yeah, it's tough talk, Susan, but in the interim, you've got American consumers, and you have the fallout from all of that and how that develops with China.
Yeah, and if you know, if you're talking about the things that Americans care most about, inflation would probably be on top of that list. And there is, of course, concern that tariff policy, especially from China, from whom we buy so very many goods, that this will be reflected in people's Christmas purchases. In their cost of living. And there's no issue that resonates more politically in the United States than that. Americans happy to stand up to China, but concerned, I think, about the effect on their own kitchen table discussions.
Yeah, we'll see. And they all talk about increased relationship, more talking between U.S. and China. We'll see where that goes. All right, the latest reaction to this fallout from the illegal orders video continues to happen. The investigation's stepping up now. Leslie, take a listen.
You can't have a functioning military if there is disorder and chaos within the ranks, and that's what these Democrat members were encouraging.
I said something that was pretty simple and non-controversial, and that was that members of the military should follow the law.
What he and his colleagues did was inappropriate. He could have taken a step back and said, why am I sending this message, which clearly is an insult to our chain of command?
Leslie, it's now 3 days of coverage after this video. What do you make of it?
I think it's going to be a nothing burger, and I think politically it's a really bad idea. The President of the United States is not served. Pete Hegseth does not have anywhere near the level and rank of these 6 individuals. And there are a lot of people in the United States who say, what was wrong with the Democrat or Republican, especially, you know, if they're veterans, because they're veterans first, Democrat and Republican second. And they look at this and they say, well, what is wrong? This is part of the U.S. military code of justice that you're not supposed to follow illegal orders. Here's another thing, though, Brett. This is very difficult legally to prosecute. And on top of that, there were people on January 6th that said that they were guilty of sedition, and the president pardoned them all. So, like I said, not a good mountain to die on.
But Matthew, you know, Martha and others have asked some of these 6, you know, what are the illegal orders, and they haven't really laid them out.
The fact that they haven't been able to produce a single illegal order just shows that this was an opportunistic play by the Democrats to their left-wing base. And I think Republicans are unified in their anger over these congressmen, and that will help the president in the fight ahead.
All right. Panel, thanks.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.